Welcome back to our listeners and viewers of the Responsible Edge podcast, brought to you by the Andrew Greenwash Charter. Today, we're asking, as AI transforms how we upgrade homes for a low-carbon future, who's being empowered and who's being left behind? In particular, we'll be reflecting on the article, AI Paving the Way for Women in Construction, a powerful look at how tech is reshaping not just construction workflows, but who gets to participate in them. And joining us to unpack all of this, I'm delighted to say, is Clare Harper, co-founder of Green Resi, author, and the host of the Return podcast. Anna, it's an absolute delight to have you on the show this afternoon. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time.
Yeah, lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, Anna, I very, very briefly introduced you there, and you are involved in so many things as we sort of sit here talking today. But for those of our viewers and listeners who aren't aware of you and your work, can you mind just giving a bit more kind of meat on the bone in terms of, what you're up to?
Yes, of course. So I run Green Resi, a business I co-founded, which is a software and service business. The idea is to enable large institutional investors to put capital into existing homes, upgrade them, and then rent them out. So our mission is to bring 10,000 vacant and underperforming homes back into use by 2030. Before starting Green Resi, I led 300 or so residential transactions without any technology. And so I know how valuable that technology is. And as you said, I've written 3 books on residential investing. One of them was on sustainable residential investing. And so, yeah, maybe we'll get to talking about some of that later. More broadly, I'm passionate about reducing inequalities by bringing capital into the housing market to deliver more and better homes, and also by democratizing the insights and information needed for a more inclusive real estate sector. So you mentioned the podcast. I chair the Cambridge University Land Society's Residential Forum. I've written about housing for publications like The Telegraph and the FT. And my most recent thing that we just discussed earlier is that I've just launched a Substack, which I'm super excited about. And it's there to share advice and stories and mentorship to empower women to lead in real estate and investing, where we have a really, really, really bad record in terms of diversity and inclusion. 2% of real estate funds are managed by women. So really behind. And the format is not limited by geography and availability. So the good thing about that 2% stat is we've got a lot of room for improvement.
The only way is up. I love that, Anna. And by the way, that was a brilliant introduction. We'll obviously provide links to Anna's LinkedIn profile and various different websites and Substacks, etc. So all of our listeners and viewers can go and dive into the depths of all the things that Anna's involved in. But let's start now, Anna, by going back to the beginning. So I'd be fascinating to know, you've obviously gone on to do amazing things already in your career, and you obviously got a really clear focus for what you're trying to achieve and the impact that you're trying to have. But let's understand the kind of inspiration and the motivation behind it. So just talk us through those kind of formative experiences that you can recall that have sort of helped shape your view of the world, perhaps through, the educational lens, perhaps through some experiences as a younger person. Just describe that to us.
I was not prepared for this question, but I will try to. So I studied land economy actually at university, and it's a really unique course that they don't do at very many universities, but they do at Cambridge. And it basically crosses finance, law, economics, everything in relation to housing. So I knew a little bit about it, and I was like, this is much more interesting than maths, right? When you start looking at like demand and supply of housing, so I started off doing economics. I did it for 2 weeks, and I was like, this is entirely, at Cambridge, it's entirely maths. That's not very interesting to me. But what is interesting is like, actually, here's supply and here's demand for housing, and you can see how it influences people's lives. So it's very tangible, and I liked that. And then when I went to the city, very early on, I was very attracted by the glamour of the city. And then I got there and I realized it was actually quite hard work. So I sort of thought, and I didn't really know that, if you're a young woman in a big organization where there aren't very many women at the top, it's quite difficult to see a path up. I couldn't really see a path up for myself. So I was like, well, fine, I'm going to invest. And then that's it, really. I'm just going to build a buy-to-let portfolio, which worked at that point. That was like 2011. And then...
Anna, sorry to interrupt you there. Like, so just for context, and obviously, as I said, viewers and listeners will be able to check out your LinkedIn profile. But you mentioned the city. Like, who are you working for at that point?
I worked at Deloitte in strategy consulting, and so I would work for big global banks and private equity firms basically for 5 years. But on the side of that, I was going down to Croydon, which is my nearest regeneration area at the time. So this is like, before Croydon kind of was that popular. And go find deals and then come back up to the city and find the money, and slightly different structures. But essentially the deal was always like, in some way, I do the work, the investor puts the money in, we split the proceeds in some way, but slightly different for different deals. So that I did for a really long time. I did while all the time I was at Deloitte, and then for about 6 years after.
And it's, I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but I just want to ask you a question on that. So you mentioned that whilst working in, obviously in as big as it gets from a consultancy perspective, you have that sense of the ceiling and the fact that, where's the opportunity here and the progression. What was it like for you to live that sort of day-to-day experience at work, and then to have this sort of creative, no cap outlet, if you like, when it comes to your sort of other role, if you like, in looking at residential property investment? Like, what was that like for you as a sort of a personal experience of sort of, the yin and the yang, if you like?
I'm not really sure, because I think it kind of goes well together, right? Like, I became quite entrepreneurial and quite self-starting because I realized that, like, if you ever want to run any kind of business, it's essentially like you have to really quickly get to know what it's like to take rejection because you get 9 no's for every 1 yes, right? So you have to kind of like be fine with that. Like, that cannot negatively impact your motivation. You have to be up for the 9 no's, otherwise you're never going to get the yes. And that's the same when you're running a deal pipeline. You have to be able to offer on 9 deals to get the 1 deal that you get over the line. You can't be attached to that. You've got to be like, let me learn from these 9 and let me target. There's a book, it's like a sales book called Go for No that you might have come across. And it's the kind of same idea, right? Like, you have to target the 9 no's. And then that way, like, by the time you've done the 9, you're probably about to get a yes anyway. But as long as you keep on learning, then it's still a positive overall experience. So I think the reason that the two kind of worked quite well together is because for at least half of the time that I was at Deloitte, I was kind of I was like an account manager for parts of it within private equity, because I moved from strategy consulting, moved internally basically, and then was sort of managing a team. And my boss always loved the fact that I was doing my own thing on the side, because he said it made me really entrepreneurial and really self-starting. And it meant that basically I could help run a team without any real direction, because the partners are so busy, they have so much going on. Then you just get on with it and like be proactive and like run things before without them telling you to do what to do, if that makes sense. Not particularly eloquent.
And was it
complement each other?
No, Anna. No. It's really interesting. And was that entrepreneurial sort of ambition, was that always there for you, or was this very much like a sort of the circumstances are at play, it just became a necessity? I've got to do something that gives me that sort of that degree of autonomy, that degree of opportunity that you were not seeing in your sort of normal professional life, if you like.
No, I don't think it was that. Both of my parents are self-employed, so I always thought I wanted to have a job. But then I got there and I didn't. Okay. No, I don't know. I actually honestly don't think it's so clear cut as that, because I think you can be like super entrepreneurial, or what they call it, entrepreneurial, within the context of an organization, or you can also be like very corporate and run a business. Like, I think it's not so much like, I don't think the line is that clear cut. But I guess the thing that, like, the lesson that I learned that I reflect on now is like, there are some companies, like some corporate organizations, where like the reward typically systematically goes towards certain types of traits. And actually one of the reasons that they struggle to get women promoted and to get women in leadership positions is because the reward mechanism basically like isn't quite subtle enough. It needs to reward like different types of leadership. For example, women typically are really amazing at like collaborative leadership, but that might not be the thing that is like looked for in the promotion. It might be more of an alpha kind of leadership style that gets rewarded in that structure, in that system. So actually, if you can try and dial it, like take a step back and go, okay, well, what are the different kinds of leader that we want, rather than like we're only going to have one, like a very alpha type. Then you end up with a load of alpha like guys at the top, which is fine, but then that does mean that any women underneath them are going to look up and be like, well, this isn't for me, like I'm leaving. I can find a more diverse organization where I can clearly flourish. There's no women flourishing here, so I'm not staying.
It's fascinating that you've highlighted that, and described it so eloquently. There's such nuance, as you say, in the reward structures and the reward cultures that we have in play, and ultimately how that facilitates one type of leader versus another in terms of being able to rise through the ranks. Let's move on though, Anna. Let's move on. So you're now in a situation, you build this portfolio yourself. What happens next?
So I built a very modest portfolio myself, and then I partnered with other investors and did a joint venture with a high net worth who wanted to build £100 million housing portfolio, and he put the money in and I did the work. We did that together. Slightly different projects, but essentially, like, I always did smaller deals. I was always at the scrappy end of the market. And then, over time, more regulations came in, and that part of the market just kind of doesn't work as well anymore, right? Like, so when I started off doing smaller development deals, it doesn't really make any sense anymore, because then you had like higher stamp duty, we had Brexit, which like helped a lot of investors to lose their confidence, and various other things that were like completely beyond our control. But it just after a while I looked at it and I'm like, the risk reward is less good, the effort to reward is less good, and like there's this massive opportunity cost to my time. And like, this doesn't feel like the growth part of the market. But what did change was that institutions started to get attracted into residential, and that's great, right? It's a different type of investor. And so I wanted to look at more at like, how can you unlock the bulk of the market for these institutions who really want to put money into residential as an asset class. So that's how I ended up doing what I'm doing.
So that was the beginning of Green Resi then?
I mean, yeah, it was a few steps before that, right? Like, I've been looking at kind of more professional delivery of residential for a long time. Green Resi was one, yeah. Like, I guess our slant on that was, okay, but it's 8 million homes in the UK worth like over 2 trillion, 2.2 trillion that are below EPCC. They need upgrading, and there's trillions of institutional capital that loves the idea of investing in UK residential, but they're just distracted by new build, which is a tiny market, and you have lots of investors competing and bidding up the pricing for new build deals. So they're actually like, you're not getting the great deal. Kind of like sometimes they're even overpaying a little, you could say. Whereas there's all this like tired landlord stock, often vacant or generally vacant, and needs upgrading. And it's like, well, all it needs is the right capital. So what if we could match the two up?
Anna, you've alluded to this before in your introduction of yourself, of kind of the ultimate sort of intention or mission, if you like, that you're on. But I want to ask you about your kind of personal mission or vision, if you like, for yourself. When you think about, and I know you're at the early stage of your career now, but when you think about the rest of your career and you reflect on what success during the rest of your career would look like, can you just describe that to us?
Yeah, I think so. So I guess the thing that I care about is inequality of opportunity. And I think there's two ways that I can most valuably reduce inequalities of opportunity. One is by delivering 10,000 homes, and the goal is by 2030. At the moment, the way that looks is aiming to retrofit 10,000 homes, bring them back to usable quality, basically. Although, I mean, they always say you should be attached to the mission, but not necessarily to how you deliver the mission. But that's how I believe that we're going to deliver the mission. And the second is by improving opportunities for women, basically. So I guess I have, over the years, ended up kind of sharing insights in a lot of different forums. I mentioned a few of them earlier. That seems to be the way that I can do it. I don't know. I'm kind of learning as we go. But when I think about what I want to help do, that 2% of women who are responsible for managing real estate funds, I know that we can improve on that. And I really think the appetite is there to do that. It's just that like women themselves don't know yet how to do it. And so if I can share the kind of stories, inspirational stories from other women, advice. So I think that's kind of how I see me having an impact there.
And Anna, on that point, you mentioned the 2%. You brought that up again. Like, if we increase that, and you're able to achieve that, what happens? What's the impact of that if we do increase the number of women that are in charge of funds in this context?
The data suggests that women are like better, and I say this in inverted commas for anyone who isn't watching the video, better, typically less, like more risk averse, but more informed decisions as investors, and that women tend to be like very high performers in terms of leading teams. So there's data to suggest that the quality of work improves when you have more women on your team. In general, more diversity and inclusion, but my particular cause, because one can't fight all of the causes, is around women. And so should be better risk reward.
So essentially, and again, excuse my oversimplification of this, Anna, for my own sake. I always blame it on my listeners and my needing to simplify it for them, but it's definitely for me in this case. But in terms of the impact of that just means that the returns that are going to be realized from this type of investment are ultimately going to be better. So it's the pure business case that if we can increase that 2% to however many percent would be, success, ultimately we're just going to realize greater returns from this form of investment.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah. Love that.
Actually, there's kind of a nice simple way of explaining like expected return. Have you ever heard this expression before, or should I explain it?
Go for it.
Your expected return is basically like the return times the probability. So if you have something that has like a really high potential return, but it's a really low probability, it might still be a lower expected return than something that was like a middle return and a middle probability. So the reason that this is relevant is because women are typically like very good at managing risk. And that's the thing that catches a lot of investors out, especially in difficult times. So having managers who are excellent at managing risk can actually lead to outperformance. Yeah. And I'm not an expert on like gender equality, but the research that I've read suggests that women do outperform men in terms of outcomes. I'm not saying they're better. I'm just saying having a more diverse and inclusive leadership will therefore lead to better commercial outcomes. So it basically, the interest of the businesses and their shareholders to have more diverse teams and leadership.
Hear. You're getting your first hear of the show, Anna, which, as I mentioned, give out for I think guests that nail particular points. Let's move forward now. And obviously the article that we're going to be talking about today very much relates to some of the themes that we've already been discussing relating to you. But would you mind, Anna, just providing a bit of an overview, a summary of the piece, and that perhaps just picking out from it whatever you thought were the most interesting points made?
Yeah. So the title was AI Paving the Way for Women in Construction. And it's essentially a really optimistic view of how AI can support inclusion in the construction space, so in real estate. And the specific areas that it touches on are it talks about virtual reality training, it talked about skills development, and it talked about the ability of AI to potentially disrupt our natural biases in real time. And I think all of that is super exciting, especially in areas like trades where, you think tech can potentially remove some of the barriers there that were in place just as a result of pure physical differences. That said, I mean, I guess my general thought on reading the article was, this is fantastic. However, the real barriers to women aren't capability, they're more structural. I think that you can split them into like 3 C's. One is that women tend to lack a community of influential sponsors. 2 is they lack control over capital. And 3 is they lack like confidence as it presents in the typical worldview. So we talked a little bit about that like in some work cultures, the trait that is rewarded is kind of alpha confidence. So I'm not saying they're not confident, but they maybe don't present in the way that people are used to seeing confidence. And AI doesn't unfortunately solve those 3 C's.
And therefore, taking what you've just said, the whole focus of the article on, as you say, the optimistic outcomes associated with AI and what it could possibly do in terms of capability, ultimately that's not addressed by really the cultural view within the construction sector of women and their role. And ultimately that's what needs to be addressed first before you're going to get to the tools and the capabilities at hand. Is that a fair...
Yeah, I don't think the reason that women are held back is a lack of capability. So I went to actually a Women in Real Estate event, and there was a person giving a talk who's like an executive coach at Goldman Sachs, and she repeated some study that's been done that essentially talked about the components of career success, and the 3 components that they described were performance, brand, and like basically sponsorship. So like how much you're being promoted. I can't remember the word they used for it. Guess which one was the most important?
Brand?
No, I think it was the like basically sponsorship. So having people put forward. I can't remember what the word. I'll remember it halfway through the podcast later. But basically, the shocking bit was that performance was responsible for 10% of career success.
Wow.
So, and when I was in the room with a lot of women. Everyone went, oh no, I've been focusing on the wrong thing. So I guess my point really is that like, this is great. It's awesome to be able to even out like skills and ensure that women have the right skills that can maybe lead to a more inclusive, like, at least it means that can't be an excuse. But I don't think that's what is holding women back. And there's also a lot of data to say that like, you can even have like a lot of, so for example, where I started my career, we were relatively even in terms of like the intake. They'd made a lot of effort at the graduate level to even out the intake, but still now diversity in leadership is like appalling the like there's an appalling lack of representation of different groups, in particular gender. So that isn't the issue, right? It's not a lack of
So you mentioned earlier, Anna, about about how we need to rethink the reward systems or structures within organizations to facilitate women being able to essentially rise through the ranks and become, more having more leadership opportunities. I wanted to ask you, like, what are the other things that organizations need to do in order to facilitate greater representation of women in leadership roles?
So I think that the more nuanced performance rating and reward and promotion structure is definitely really important. Like if you have like 10 things that you need to achieve before you get to the next rung, and like 9 of them are things that pretty well are like very like in inverted commas masculine, and like actually you've got some women who are like really awesome at other things but they're just not on the list, then that's definitely a thing to rethink. But the other thing that I think would be really impactful is more like embedding sponsorship a bit more. I actually only recently discovered the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. But I was told it by someone really in the know. I think she's like a senior HR director in real estate, and she explained that sponsorship is like having someone advocating for you when you're not in the room, having someone put you forward for things. Whereas mentorship is typically like, you're having a conversation with your mentor. Like I have an amazing mentor who I speak to every week, and I share what's happening that week, and he helps me to work out what it actually means for me and how to make it. In his words, he's like, well, when you've had 5 years of experience, do you want 5 years where you've learned the same thing 5 times, or do you want to be like compounding that learning. And this, for me, the mentorship helps me compound that learning. So I'm always learning new, like better, always going up the ladder, not repeating the same learnings. But yeah, sponsorship is really important too, because that's having someone put you forward for stuff. And I have found that that is really, really impactful, right? Having someone say, oh, hey, I recommended you for this job, or I recommended you for this speaking event or whatever, is super impactful. So if we can embed that culturally, and for example, have senior leaders kind of almost marked on their ability to bring up the next generation of leaders, but make sure that's diverse, I think that would be the thing that would move the dial.
And that, Anna, that's a brilliant observation. And you can just see, I think the people would throw the phrases around of, the good old boys club, for example, of senior leaders all being men, and obviously the sponsorship element being a very, the golf day, the not to overgeneralize or over stigmatize, but how do you go about, what would you like to see done within organizations where perhaps at the moment senior leadership is fairly male, it's not diverse, there's not a lot of names and voices on that, right? What needs to be done in order to inspire those leaders that are in those positions, in order to understand the role and responsibility that they have, in order to sponsor, as you've alluded to, the next generation of leaders that do represent a more diverse mix, if you like? What can be done?
When I started, so I think I said earlier, I run the residential forum for the Cambridge University Land Society, and a lot of the people who are involved with that are really, really like sensible, successful people. And one of them in particular said to me, Anna, the thing you got to do first is make sure you know who is going to be your successor, because the whole job of a leader is to make sure they've got someone going to replace them, because ultimately you want to do yourself out of the job, right, at some point. And I think that's actually a really good principle, right? Is if in every leadership position there was a thing which was, you need to know who your successors are, you need to be bringing the next generation up. So if that's part of your performance review, like, how many future leaders have you helped? Then I think that would be a good thing.
And that's such a simple, initiative for any organization to adopt, isn't it? It just requires a more thoughtful way of viewing, as you alluded to, sponsorship and the role that plays. I want to ask you, what
I must say though, Charlie, like in my experience, like it's super rewarding helping people, right? Like this is literally the most rewarding change. That it's not going to reward them financially necessarily, but like, on an individual level, it needs to be like written into your job description, because there's no specific financial reward for like having successors, or maybe it should be, but I don't think there is right now. But from a kind of personal perspective, there's nothing more rewarding than like helping the next generation. Why do you think so many people have kids?
Here, indeed. And I'm fascinated by that distinction between mentoring and sponsorship. Do you think the lines do blur? I mean, does mentoring not lend itself naturally to sponsorship as well? Or do you think that there needs to be this, you've already positioned it. There needs to be this specific focus on not only how can you mentor and support somebody sort of one-to-one, but how can you go about fighting their, or not fighting, but looking for and promoting them for opportunity externally. That's the crucial point.
Again, I am not an expert in this. I'm an enthusiast, I would say, because like I think I've spent most of my career up till now like trying not to draw any attention to my gender, trying like it not be a thing. Like I think I told you about this before, but the move I was trying was like kind of the ostrich, where it's like, okay, listen, like if I don't pay attention to this, maybe no one else will notice, like that I might be the only woman in the room. And it's not a very effective strategy, because obviously everyone notices, but like I've really tried to like this not be a thing up until very recently. So I'm really at the beginning of my learning on this, but as I understand it, you need both. You need mentors and you need sponsors, and you need to be a mentor and a sponsor in order to bring the next generation of leaders up. And I see only benefits to that, right? Like the people who do the best are the people who are really well connected. They have mentors and sponsors, and they mentor and sponsor themselves.
Anna, let me take you back to the article. Obviously, the article talks about the use of AI in the construction sector and how ultimately this will help to democratize and provide women with greater opportunity. But let me ask you about how, from a green resi perspective, you guys are looking to utilize or to develop using AI and software. Just talk us through, what your approach is.
Yeah. So I guess one of the most important things is that in residential property, there are quite simple tasks, but that you have to do quite a lot. Typically, so this is not necessarily a technology issue, it's a process issue. But when you break down the processes, a lot of them can be automated and using technology. And there's a couple of benefits to this. One is that you can do things a lot cheaper, because if a machine does something, you can therefore have your human doing the more expensive, more strategic tasks and have the machine doing the cheap tasks. So the stuff that is just, ticking a box or whatever, a machine can do it.
And Anna, can you give us examples within the context of your work as to what those sorts of tasks would look like?
Sure. So as an example, one of the features we have is around filtering through available properties. They can be on or off market properties, but if you have the postcode, then you can assess whether it meets your criteria to buy. So that criteria might be, okay, it is in this particular postcode area. It's a yes or no. You don't need a human to make that decision. Or it could be, okay, we only want to buy properties that cost less than £10,000 to upgrade to EPC-C. Again, it's really easy for the machine to just say yes or no and just say, they can filter. It takes no more time to filter 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 properties, whereas with a person, it would take a lot longer. So that's a good example where, it's not a difficult task. It's a task that a machine can do with the right data and the right automation really easily. Mm-hmm. So cost is a big benefit. Second is speed, which I guess time is money in business, so it's kind of the same. And then the third one, which is really important, is accuracy. So if you had a person looking through 10,000 properties to assess which ones could be upgraded to EPC-C for less than £10,000, firstly, it's going to take them ages. Secondly, it's going to cost you loads because it's going to take ages. And thirdly, they're probably going to get some of them wrong because they're going to get bored. And that's what happens when we have humans doing tasks that can easily be automated and done by basically automated. They can be automated. So that's a big principle, is that most processes in real estate are pretty inefficient. And if you break down the process and you improve the whole process using technology where you can, then you can do things cheaper, faster, and better quality.
And does that ultimately, coming back to your point at the very beginning about the work that you're doing to try and engage institutional investors to see the investment in the residential retrofit market as a real opportunity and trying to draw that capital towards that opportunity, is the utilization of AI and software, is that key and fundamental to allowing that to happen? And if so, just how is that going to facilitate that attraction, if you like, from those institutional investors?
I think reliability is key for institutions. They need to be able to see that the right decisions are being made. So and that is the case whether you're underwriting a deal. So the process that we talked about earlier, where you're kind of filtering through, and then you're ultimately going to underwrite that deal, and you're going to say, okay, well, you should be paying £300,000 for this property because its market value is £450,000, and we're only going to need to spend £20,000 to get it to EPCB or whatever, whatever the maths are. Mm-hmm. But you need to be able to present that underwrite in a way that is totally and utterly reliable, using triangulated different data sources. And you need to do that quickly, because no institution wants to get out of bed for a £300,000 deal. They typically would look at 50 million as an appropriate minimum kind of consideration. It's not really worth it because it's costly for them to get out of bed, metaphorical bed. So you need to have that, they need to be able to see that they've got a pipeline that is absolute minimum 50 million. But ideally, you really want to be talking in the billions. And so your individual £300,000 property is kind of irrelevant. And it's decisions just need to be so efficient and so reliable at that stage that they don't need to worry about it.
And presumably, and again, tell me if I'm completely misunderstanding this, but from a new build perspective, things are so much easier to analyze in a sense because everything is typically more uniform than when working with retrofit property. Is that a fair fair observation?
I think there's definitely a bias in the market towards new build because they're shiny, right? Like it looks like there's no problems because it's just been built, and the photography looks like there's no problems. It doesn't necessarily always mean that there's no problems, but it's just that, like, basically, I think the difference. Actually, we had a big investment bank get in touch the other day, and they said, "Why do you think that no one is investing in existing residential when it's obviously such a better risk reward?" And I was like, because I think that there is a difference between perceived risk and actual risk. And people see new build as being lower risk.
Really?
It's not because it is. It's just because it's perceived as that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And perceived as that because there's more control over, or appears to be more control over the product, if you like, itself, i.e. it's a new build versus something that we don't necessarily have the clarity around in terms of an older property. Is that a fair?
Yeah. That's a fair assessment. I think so. But there is the data on existing property, so it's actually kind of a bit of a false assumption. But all institutions investing in housing is what I want to see. I don't really care where it goes. I just think that there's a bit of an overlooked opportunity in existing homes.
And as you've described perfectly, the use of AI and of software to enable the clarity around and the confidence in the data that's providing, that opportunity to present to institutional investors is crucial.
It's really critical. And I think the thing that is kind of worth mentioning is, like, when we started Green Resi, we started by focusing on the private rental sector, tired landlords selling properties, but then realized very quickly that actually, like, the more immediate opportunity is, social housing, right? Like, housing associations own millions of homes, many of which need upgrading. And so there's a very obvious and natural, like, it's the same, like the proportions that are below EPCC are slightly different, but and the way that you do things is slightly different, but it's essentially the same problem, which is like, you need to improve these homes, and you need to understand how you're spending money, and you need to do it efficiently, and you need to basically be able to put an investment case together in addition to using your grant funding, and you need to do that without disrupting all the people that live in the properties right now. So it's another set of, like, very similar but also very complicated problems that we've been looking at helping solve.
Well, I have to say, having had the chance to meet with you beforehand and obviously do this podcast together, I'm delighted that you're the one who's looking to try and address these issues and come up with the solutions, Anna. It's fascinating to hear about your work and the impactful goals that you've set for yourself. Let's conclude now. I'm fascinated to see what you're going to do with this, because obviously we've touched upon some very varied areas during our conversation today. But with your magic wand, if I was to ask you, you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
I think if I had a magic wand, what I would try to do is what we talked about earlier, which is to embed sponsorship, not just mentorship, into every senior leader's role. And, then it's not just about, like, having coffee chats. It's about putting forward the next generation for opportunities, and advocating for diverse talent when they're not in the room. So I guess the reason that I thought about this was because, and it's a theme very closely tied to what's in the article, is like, most women don't lack talent in real estate and investing, but they do lack the visibility and the backing. And that's been the difference, I think, between I think that's the gap basically that we need to fill. So yeah, that's what I would do with my magic wand. And I think the result of that could include better commercial outcomes, better risk management, which also leads over time to better outcomes, and more equality.
I love it, Anna. The case is clear. Not that there should necessarily have to be a commercial case associated with this stuff. It just seems like the the right thing to be doing and the most morally right
No,
thing
we
to
need
do.
a commercial case. We need a commercial case because no one who wants to make change unless they think they're missing out on something. This is one thing I've learned over the last couple of years. Sorry to interrupt your outro, but I think it's pretty important, right? Like, unless there's pain, people won't change.
Here.
So people need to know that they're missing out on something, right? Like, you need to see your competitor is outperforming you before you will change. Fine. But like, that's happening now because there are some forward-thinking organizations that are promoting women and they are outperforming the others. That's where the data comes from. So if you see your competitors are outperforming you, it's not going to take you long to change your ways.
And out of interest, Anna, just you've alluded to some of the companies that are already showing this sort of return, if you like, in terms of the way that they're investing in women and promoting women. Can you give us some examples that we can link to?
Yes, I probably can, but I can't off the top of my head. yeah. Leave that for later.
We'll find them and we'll include them in the editorial piece that we put together. Anna, thank you so much. I know that was a whistle stop tour, but that was a fascinating insight, and I know we've covered a lot. But yeah, thank you so much for giving up some of your time this afternoon and joining us.
We have covered a lot. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it, and yeah, I look forward to watching and listening later. Thank you.
Excellent stuff. Thanks, Anna. And that's all for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A huge thank you to Anna Clare Harper for sharing her insights on how we retrofit not just homes, but the construction and real estate industry itself. We also had a particularly interesting dialogue around women in the construction and real estate sectors as well, which was fascinating. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by the Andrew Greenwash Charter, championing responsible sustainability communications. Visit andrewgreenwashcharter.org to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.